So my name is Marcela Borge, and today I have a pleasure of introducing our Fisher Series speaker. And I was quite happy when I was asked if I would introduce him because it gave me an excuse to stop writing and read some of his recent work related to increasing the quality of educational opportunities for students in MOOC environments. Now, given how expensive and out of reach higher education is becoming, free, massive, open online courses seemed like a potentially transformative idea. Think about it. A way to provide access to high-quality educational experiences to anyone who desired it. The problem is that quality education is more than just the transmission of knowledge. It is about fundamentally understanding and meeting the needs of students. And when MOOCs were initially designed, they were not designed in consideration of the human element or with regard to everything that we know about how people learn. Because of this, MOOCs have perpetuated teaching models at massive scales that educational researchers have long identified as suboptimal. So there are many design problems associated with MOOCs, and the question is, do we let the idea of free, high-quality education die? Or do we all roll up our sleeves and do what we need to do to improve the current situation? Our speaker today has taken up the challenge that is MOOC reform. Dr. Klemmer is an associate professor of cognitive science and computer science and engineering at UC San Diego, where he is the co-founder and co-director of the Design Lab. He is well known in the field of human-computer interaction for his innovative human-centered design research and has won numerous awards for his high-quality work. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Scott Klemmer.
Thank you. It's really great to be here today. And I think it's an auspicious start that we got a reminder about the difficulties of technology-enhanced education. And I wanted to start with a story. I was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, so not too far from here. And recently I moved to Southern California. And I started swimming in the ocean. I never was a swimmer when I grew up. But in Southern California, it's really magical to be able to swim in the ocean. It's a totally different experience than swimming in the pool, which was the option when I lived in colder climates. And I think that shift, that difference between swimming in the ocean and swimming in the pool is something that we're seeing in the field of human-computer interaction and in design generally. That 20 years ago, human-centered design really meant that you would build most of your interface. When you got it mostly done, you would bring somebody into the lab and you would let them try it out. And when they got stuck, they would swear. You write down what happened, you would fix that usability or software bug, and then bring somebody else in. And then you would rinse and repeat until you ran out of money or time, and then you would release it. And once you released your software, you had no idea what anybody did with it. And of course, software as a service has really changed that. And it's changed it in a couple of ways. As we know, it's possible to be able to find out what people are doing with your application once it runs. And even more powerfully, we have the ability to do science tractably in a way that we didn't previously. And that lets us try out multiple alternatives and compare them and iterate based on that. And that's a huge shift in the designer's role. And the companies that are doing this well, these are some of my former graduate students who have started companies. And the companies that are doing this well, it's tremendously exciting. However, for every Instagram or other one of these companies that you see up here, there's a ton of failures. More than 90% of startups fail. That's about the same as restaurants or projects or almost anything else. Most government software fails. And many of these systems fail, even though the people involved have a tremendous amount of skill, high levels of motivation, good ideas, and believe that they would succeed. So why is project failure so common? I think the answer is that a lot of the principles that we have for doing design and for learning, what people do is often faith-based rather than research-based, as Marcella mentioned in the introduction. Now, sometimes espoused ideas are really effective, but for totally different reasons than people initially think. And one common challenge that I've observed in design and in online education is that people underexplore at the beginning and then don't start to really diverge until it's too late. That novices in general explore too few ideas early on. And this is one of the concerns that I think a lot of us have about online education. Which could be the voice of Kurt Lewin. One of my favorite quotes of his is he says that nothing is so practical as good theory. He was one of the founders of action research and somebody who really believed in taking the principles of social psychology and applying them to real world problems and revising those principles in concert, that science was not something that just happened in the lab, it happened in the world. And when we think about this in terms of design, and in particular designing online education experiences, why do we have this shortfall? Well, for those of you from engineering, you know that engineering excels at practical theory. When you build a bridge, there's a lot of theory that you can draw on. But this theory is from the physical sciences. The human world is different, and it's different in a couple of ways. The first one is that introspection is valuable, but it's often misleading. And for anyone with a background in the social sciences, having a debate with somebody who doesn't, you know the frustrating experience that they're like, I've thought about my own behavior, and I understand that the science says X, but I thought about it and I don't work that way actually. And that's really, you don't get in that kind of argument with a bridge. And industry is empirical in the modern age. The industry is in the wild, swimming in the ocean, running these experiments, learning from data. But the goal is product focused rather than building theory. And so in the design lab, our vision of design at large is that we have an opportunity to build practical theory with real world experiments and then bake that theory into real software that real people use that transforms a field. And today we're going to talk about this from the vantage point of learning. And is this possible? I mean, some people see design as intrinsically mystical and impervious to investigation because creative work is complex and multifarious. And where I do see theoretical work, it can sometimes sacrifice relevance in the name of rigor. And so I think some people see, well, there's science that happens in the lab, and there's life that happens in the real world. And for complex things like design and learning, ne'er the pairing shall meet. I think part of this is, if you look at a great artist or photographer or creative person like Ansel Adams, he appears to throw his hands up and say, there's no rules of composition in photography. In other words, there's no theory. There are only good photographs. And what I think about that's interesting about this quote is that Ansel Adams actually wrote the book on the rules of composition in photography. In fact, he wrote not just one book, he wrote 3 books on the rules of composition and darkroom technique and all sorts of stuff in photography. And so you figure either this guy's a little nuts or he's trying to tell us something. And I think it's important to be charitable in terms of our impressions of people. And so let's assume that I think what Ansel is trying to tell us is that there are absolutely rules of composition and printmaking and everything else in photography and other creative endeavors. But that the ultimate crucible of success is not whether you follow the rules, but whether the print or the photograph itself is really good. And I think where we can make our path forward is a dialectic between looking at examples and learning from examples that are successful and trying to distill principles from that, and then building theory based on real-world experiments. Now, one worry that people have about using examples as a way of moving a creative field forward is you say, well, maybe it just increases conformity. And a good example of that is this is Stephen Smith's work, where what he did was he gave people, he asked people to draw an alien, most creative alien you can. And he either gave people a prime of aliens that all had antenna and 4 legs and a tail, or there was no example-based prime. And what he found is that if you prime people with aliens that all look like this, the aliens that they draw also look like this. So you might be worried about this, and you might say something like, well, is nothing new ever going to be created? Well, I don't think we should fear too much. Marsh ran the same study as this, and with a twist, same exact study, the only difference was the measure. And if instead of measuring whether some people riff on your examples, you measure how many novel features they have, there's zero decrease in the number of novel features in the presence of examples. And so what that tells me is that people rely on examples when they don't have something creative to add. And when they have a good idea, they'll put it forward on their own. So you might say, well, that's fine. This works great for the small stuff. You want to make a little increment here, a little increment there. That's great. But we can't do the big innovations that way. And man, online education right now, or design right now, where we're moving to the Internet of Things or we're moving to MOOCs, things are changing so fast, this won't work. And this is exactly the viewpoint of Edgar Dijkstra, who I think articulates this really well, where he says that, metaphors and analogies, we link the new to the old, the novel to the familiar. And under sufficiently slow conditions, this works well. But with a sharp discontinuity, this method breaks down. Our past experience is no longer relevant, the analogies become too shallow, and the metaphors become more misleading than illuminating. And this is the situation for radical novelty. And in Dijkstra's view, computer science is always having this stuff happen. And if you read Wired magazine or something like that, you might also believe that we're currently in this state of radical novelty. The best way I know how to refute that viewpoint is with an example. This is a painting many of you may know. It's Picasso's painting, Demoiselles d'Avignon. And in the spring of 1907, he made a ton of 400 some odd sketches in preparation for this work. And his biographer, John Richardson, describes this as the most talked about painting of the 20th century. There may be a few others that can lay a similar claim. The reason that this painting is so discussed and so important is that it was one of the founding moments for Cubism and abstract modern art. And you see that in particular in the faces that are present in this photograph. And so you might wonder where Picasso got this great idea from. Well, that spring, his friends took him to the Trocadero, which at the time was the ethnographic museum of Paris. And in the Trocadero, he saw these fang sculptures, which were recently arrived. It was a traditional African sculpture, and it has this wonderful way of representing the face that was well known in one place and completely unknown in France at the time. And Picasso was extremely taken with these, so taken with these that one of his friends came back later, brought a trench coat, and grabbed one of these sculptures. And if you look at studio pictures of Picasso's studio from this time period, you see one of these sculptures in the background. And so you can see how Picasso was able to translate an insight from one domain in one place into a very different domain. And I think this is why he said that good artists borrow and great artists steal. And what I take away from this is that metaphor and analogy and example are extremely important, but that the scale of the jump is relative to the size of the innovation. And that people that we call creative are people who are able to make larger leaps with those kinds of metaphors and analogies and draw metaphors and analogies from more distal domains. I think one of the best ways of creating a system like this is the design studio. And the design studio was founded in 1819 with the beginning of the École des Beaux-Arts, also in Paris. And it's endured for nearly 200 years because of several practices that I think reinforce each other and create a powerful learning experience. There's a lot of shoulder-to-shoulder learning that happens in the design studio. And it can happen informally where when there's, you'll see Barbie dolls and umbrellas and water coolers and all sorts of stuff, and that person's got a glue gun, and that person gave up on what they were doing. And so if you want to know who the expert is, oh yeah, well, it's the person over there who's doing that thing. And if you want to know, well, what would have happened if I had gone that path? One of your classmates probably did, and so you can see the outcome. And the challenge of the studio model of education is that traditionally it's been extremely time consuming. This is one of the most labor intensive models that we know. And so my PhD student, Chinmay Kulkarni, and I, what I'm about to present is largely his work, started to think about how we might scale the design studio to something at a global scale. And what I want to emphasize with this is that what we're after is not just or maybe even primarily an efficiency gain. We're interested in doing things at global scale that are qualitatively different than what you might do in the real world. And so we're not going to make a VR studio where you walk around and go up to somebody's glue gun. That would always be a pale facsimile. Instead, what we're going to try to do is to think about the function of the studio and how can we be inspired by that function in an online world. I think there are a couple of ingredients that are key to effective learning in the studio that are difficult to scale. So this is the challenge that we set for ourselves. To think about the function whoa, we're getting a little bit of reverb there. The first of these is feedback on open-ended work. That if you have some kind of storyboard or sketch or something else, what you see in the studio is that the master offers critique and you see all these diverse alternatives. The second one of these is that there's a big opportunity online, even more than in person, for seeing diverse perspectives. That if you have people all over the world, how can we leverage that? In a studio, you see 17 alternatives to an assignment. Boy, just think about what we could do online. And the third of these is that the creation and iteration of lots and lots and lots and lots of designs is part and parcel of any kind of creative work. All of us have written something and know how many evolutions a paragraph or an essay or a book goes through. This is an example of the first Microsoft mouse, made more than 100 different prototypes. So what I'd like to do is show you a couple of the software systems that my research group has made and look at what we've learned from the experience of swimming in the ocean with these research systems. I think that the paradox of peer processes, so we're going to talk about having peers assess their colleagues' work, is if they're students in a class, right? So they are intrinsically non-experts. If you're going to talk about peer assessment, you're saying we're going to have non-experts do exactly the activity that we've asked experts to do. And this is one reason that students and teachers and others alike are really leery of peer assessment. The way that we've gotten around this that I think serves a couple of goals at once is a technique that we've adapted called calibrated peer review. And calibrated peer review, which was popularized by UCLA, you first give people a training phase where they see some examples of assignments that calibrate them on the criteria. And then they assess their peers, and at the end of the process, they're going to assess their own work. And what the user interface that we built in collaboration with Coursera looks like is you can see somebody submit a sketch like this, and then they'll go and they will go to a drop-down menu where we see the different attributes, the line items of a rubric, and they give their peers feedback that is multifaceted, gives both a number and also a qualitative element. This has been used. We've had more than 200,000 students sign up in my class, though not all did the project. And we've seen more than 100 different MOOCs where people have used this software. And we've been able to look back and see, where did this succeed? Where did this fail? What's going on? So one of the main things that we see, and every instructional designer in this room will be feeling my pain here, is that if you have a software idea or a pedagogical style, different instructors adopt it differently. Some instructors got rid of the training phase. They thought it would be too much work, it'd be kind of a pain, we don't need that. Without good training, peer assessment totally fails because you've got that paradox. You're asking novices to be experts. And unless you do something, that doesn't work. Now, if you add in a training phase, then we see things work much, much better. And the way that we were able to evaluate this is that when people assess their peers, one of the items that they assess, we also have a ground truth staff grade for. And so we're able to compare the peer grades with the staff grade. And what we see is that for a pass-fail course, like many of the MOOCs that we have today, there's a really strong agreement between the people who would get a certificate if it were staff graded and the people who would get a certificate if it were peer graded. And so the people who wouldn't in the staff graded case, nearly all. The people who would, also nearly all. It works pretty darn well. But the wonderful thing about scale is the opportunity to reach lots of people. The terrible thing about scale is that, let's call it 2%. When you multiply that by scale, that's a lot of people. And in particular, we see this challenge for novel answers. That one student who emailed a colleague, and I convinced them to let me use this quote in a talk, says, this whole peer review thing, it's just like checking stuff off a check sheet. What's the world coming to? This is like talking about dog poop. And I love that kind of like, we've all gotten that student frustration from somebody about some aspect of a course that we've taught. This shows up particularly when you're talking about novel work, which is a lot of what's really exciting about the global classroom, is that people do different stuff than you would have ever thought of doing in a million years. And so here are some submissions from an art assignment where people are just doing really cool and creative stuff. And you can see in terms of an example viewing perspective, that creativity is part of the message of an art class. There are so many ways to interpret an assignment. From a grading perspective, this can be a challenge. And so this is our return of the novices as experts paradox. We do the best we can to be able to capture what we're trying to get after in a rubric. And one thing that we see is that you see a bunch of work and you write the rubrics based on that. And then you see a bunch more work and you go, oh, the rubric doesn't capture that. And then you can iterate and oscillate back and forth, but you'll never be able to get everything. And so one thing that we do now is we offer the ability for people to check an assignment as being outside the box. This is interesting in a way that I have no idea how to mark on the sheet, but I'm into it anyhow. And I think that emphasizing that there's lots of paths to success, not all of which we can write down ahead of time, is really important for creative work. The other thing that we see is that there are, if you look at any particular assignment, if you've ever taught a large class and graded lots of people, you see this experience where the same 8 or 9 success modes and failure modes show up again and again, and in slightly different forms. And so what we did is that we write these down when we see them into what we call fortune cookies. And a fortune cookie is a generalized pattern of feedback for a student that can then be customized. And this is helping to scaffold students' ability to talk like experts, because if you ask people to give critique, absent some starter, it can feel like a deer in the headlights. But if you say, does one of these 9 things resonate with what you're seeing in this submission? People could say, yeah, well, it's kind of like this one. You can rewrite it and expand and modify however you want. And not only does that mean that the student is getting better feedback, but that the reviewer is learning to behave and talk like an expert. One of the amazing things about teaching an online class is all of the ways that students make it their own, that the most active students do all sorts of amazing stuff. And there's been a lot made in the news that a large fraction of students don't complete courses they begin. I'm not sure that's always a bad thing. I'm not sure that everybody intends to. I signed up for my friend Andrew Ng's machine learning class. I just wanted to check it out. The flip side of that is that the people who are at the really, really exciting end of this do all sorts of stuff. Like one student took every single book I mentioned in the entire class and made a web page that linked through to Amazon based on that. Can we turn down the audio speakers? We're getting a real reverb up on a delay. We also saw it's been really fun to play around on social media and see what people get excited about. Here's one example, is people post lots of what they're working on Twitter. Also, I asked students, I was curious, in a physical classroom, you can see the expressions of everybody's face and you get a sense of who the students are. In an online classroom, you lose all of that. So I just asked on Twitter, I was like, hey, if you're taking a class, post a setting of where your where you do your coursework. And so we got a student from the woods outside Moscow. We got somebody who was working after the kindergartner's birthday party. We get people on tablets, working in coffee shops, all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of fun. And it also gives you an opportunity to build an alumni network where students who have graduated from the class and earned a certificate can be part of a social media group where they share professional tips with each other. And so one of the ways that we can make online education be more than just watch a video and take a quiz is that we can build these long-term communities. And the traffic on our LinkedIn group is not massive. It's, I don't know, a message every day or two. But it's really cool questions that people ask. I'm learning a lot from it. People often make their own learning materials that are better than the stuff that I did. And the best projects, like Chandramouli, his design project in my class got taken up by the UN and used in hundreds of schools all around India. And so the one extreme of the students in this experience is just awesome. In a design studio, you have these small group discussions that really become a big part of what students are learning. And we were curious whether we could do something like that in a global classroom. As you all know, in a global classroom, if you do it right, you can take advantage of different professional knowledge and different culture. And if we have students engage with diverse peers, that can force them to articulate stuff which otherwise would have remained tacit. But people don't automatically always seek out diverse peers. I mean, sometimes we do. That's why we travel. Let's see there. All right. So what we see here is students often form groups based on country of origin or other stuff. And I think that's great and awesome. And we should absolutely support this. And we kind of want to do a little bit of both, where we have a setting for you to connect with peers from your home country or who speak the same language, but also do some engagements for diversity. And so what we did, this is something that Chinmay talked about at CSCW just on Tuesday morning, is we have students sign up for small group video discussions. And in these small group video discussions, you'll talk with half a dozen peers, and you'll talk about the course content. And this is one actually with the social psychology instructor, Scott Plouse of Wesleyan, who had these wonderful discussion groups made for his students at Wesleyan that he adapted to the online setting. And in fact, many of the most successful online curricula that we've seen are things that have been iterated over a bunch of years in a local classroom and then expanded or tweaked or modified to be brought online. So the way that it works is we'll assign you to one of a small bunch of parallel groups, and we try to get an equal balance of gender, and we try to maximize global geographic diversity, and which is not hard given the setup of the class. And here's one student talking about their experience.
It's very flexible. You get people from Ukraine, from India, from Swiss, from South Africa. They're coming all together in a very open way. The first time there was also a lady from Australia, and she was working in the gambling industry. She was very evocative, very she was very bright. There was this guy from China as well. He worked in Geneva for the United Nations. Completely over-frustrated by bureaucracy. So you meet all those people from over the whole world and coming together and discussing the same theories. That's really exciting.
And what we see is that students are, on average, as far away, the average kilometers distance is as far away as New York to London. And a majority of these groups had 4 or more countries involved in these discussions. We were curious to see how well whether the presence of diversity impacted students' course performance in the class and also the length of the discussion. And what we see is that students in diverse groups spent twice as long in discussions as we asked them to. And when we looked at whether participating in discussions helps and whether the diversity amplifies those benefits, this is a study that a controlled experiment that we ran in Darren Ariely's irrational behavior class. So our measure here is going to be course grade. And we assign them either to the discussion condition or to the no discussion condition. And we see that students who participate and talk about, and this is among people who asked to. So everybody says, yes, I'd like to participate. Half the people get to do so. And we see that they do better in the course by about 6% than those that we put in the waitlist condition. So participation is indeed helpful. And in terms of the benefits of diversity, we ran a study in Scott Plous's social psychology class where we looked at the relative performance based on how many countries were involved. And what we see is, oops, hey there, is that students who are in diverse classrooms actually perform about 2.5% better. And then in another class, we saw about a 3.5% improvement in course outcome. This is purely multi-country talkabouts versus same country. So we see that participation in these small group discussions increases retention, and diverse participation even more. Now, it doesn't always work. For example, here's a student who was without internet. That's something that's beyond our current ability to do something about. Other startups in this space are thinking about that. Surprisingly to us, a huge fraction of people who participated in these talkabouts exchanged email or something else afterwards. And so, for example, in a women's health and human rights class, many of the students were sharing email. Really cool to see. Overall, we've seen about 5,000 students from north of 100 countries participate in this. And the students themselves translated these materials into both French and Spanish. So far, we've talked about being able to scale peer assessment. So the peer feedback that you see in the studio, we've created an online experience for. And we've created an online experience for the small group discussions that you might get in a studio. The other thing that you get in a studio that's tremendously valuable is not just summative feedback, but the reason that you're in the studio all week and not just on crit day is you get the formative feedback. You try something out, and you say, how's this looking? And you get feedback based on there. And you learn a lot both by giving and receiving the feedback. So we built a system called Peer Studio that we shared at Learning at Scale recently to be able to do this formative feedback. And we're going to try and get the feedback to people as quickly as possible, because I've heard that some students start assignments not like 3 weeks before the deadline, but maybe a little closer than that. And so the challenge that we're trying to get at here is that in the first system of calibrated peer review, there's a fairly hefty training burden. And I know I've talked with a couple of people this morning who have tried peer assessment and were frustrated by the students were frustrated by the training burden. You spend 10 hours doing the assignment and you tack on another 2 for training. That's hard to sell. So what we're going to do is we will, based on some of Dedri Gentner's work on analogical training for feedback, in her cases she was looking at business school cases, is we're going to give people examples right in line of the peer review system. So here's an excellent example on a variety of dimensions. And then you can give this formative feedback relative to something that's very good And so it can make really salient where the assignment is not quite there yet. So you get to see these particular elements, and we found that it works really well. It also, remarkably, people get feedback really quickly. That left-hand bar, which constitutes a large fraction of the assignments, are people who get feedback on their first submission in about 10 minutes. This was in Barb Oakley and Terry Sanowski's Learning How to Learn class. But feedback is not always actionable, and that's true for professors too. So here's an example of professor-given feedback where it's a little bit hard to tell what you need to do. You know, you get things like awkward or needs to be better. And that can be, well, you don't know what you want to do. And so what we've seen is that we need to be able to give people more topical feedback. And so what we're going to do is the tips that you see here. We'll give people, as you start typing feedback to the peer, we have some very simple NLP, nothing fancy at all. If your feedback's really short or includes some target words that we know to be vague, we'll give you some prompts. And we again have these fortune cookies for being able to scaffold the kind of actionable feedback that you want to be able to get to be able to revise your work. So we give people an internal score based on each of the rubric dimensions. And one change that we've made over the couple of years that we've been doing this is we've shifted from multi-value items to yes/no questions. And we've shifted from having the reviewer rate in terms of points. You saw in that first video, they actually selected a score value. Now they select label attributes because we want to emphasize the intellectual content, not the scoring nature. And students never fail to sufficiently emphasize the scoring nature of what's going on. But it can be easy to forget that there's an intellectual part going on too. And when you do that as a rater, I think that's really helpful. And here are the tips that you give. So without the hints, what we see that students write their peers is people say, you know, I think you're trying to do this, or I wish you would do that, or I hope you would do this. And with the hints that our NLP, very rudimentary, gives students, then they actually add a little bit about what they could do better. So in order to, you need to, and you see a little bit of help there. When you get this fast feedback, so if we, in a controlled experiment, we either released students their feedback at the time it was given, or we delayed it to be 24 hours. And what we see is that if you get the feedback right away, within an hour, it raises your course grade by about 4.5%. This is in a medical education class. And if we delay the feedback 24 hours, which is common in many peer review systems, that it would be at least a day, then there's no improvement in grades relative to having no early feedback at all. So what we've seen is the ability to do peer assessment at scale, to be able to discuss work with a small group of peers, and to be able to get formative feedback as you care about it. Students care a lot more about the right answer to the exam question before or during the exam than they do after the exam. And I hope I've motivated that this is an instance of a broader strategy where we can use the real world to be able to build practical theory. And that one of the great powers of doing this for online education is that you can bake the pedagogy into software that transforms learning. And this second point really came to me by accident. I saw how many of the design decisions that we made for one particular class automatically translated to every other class, which is something that you don't see as much in the on-land syllabi, that You know, if Larry makes an improvement in his class, then I don't get that automatically. But if we have a common software and we make an improvement, then that rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that's probably one of the not sufficiently understood game changers and benefits of software-mediated education. Now, being able to do this kind of stuff is extremely multidisciplinary. It comes not just from computer science, not just from education, not just from design, but from all across the university. And with the new UC San Diego Design Lab that we've started, we're intentionally housed in a building that is not part of any department. It's a multidisciplinary place. And I think that what we can do by swimming in the ocean is we often hear a story about research as being on a spectrum between fundamental insight and practical impact. And the Professor Donald Stokes pointed out that these aren't necessarily opposed, that you can break that axis and turn it into two. Not everything that lacks fundamental impact, not everything that lacks practical insight has fundamental impact. And some things that do have practical impact also advance our fundamental understanding. And this is what Stokes calls Pasteur's quadrant, things that both advance our fundamental understanding and simultaneously create a practical impact. The way that we do this in the design lab is that I think of a lot of computer science and systems creation research as being like creating a postcard from the future. That you're imagining what the future could be. And then through our prototypes and research papers, we send back to the present one instance of what that future might be. And what I wanted to come here and hopefully motivate to everybody here that I see as a huge goal in the space of online learning is how do we today is not the day for technology to work. So how do we scale these personalized mastery learning experiences? And with that, I'll stop here because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was really very interesting, very thought-provoking. And my thoughts are about how do we take these larger lessons that you've been gathering and bring them back into even smaller scale, courses that might only have 30 students or 50 students. There's a lot to think about there. Just by way of protocol, if you have a question for Scott, please let me know because we want you on the mic so that our guest external can hear from you as well. Jerry?
I have a question whether or not you ever looked at the effect of file size and speed of connection in student performance. The reason why I ask that is I teach online classes, and I try to stick to very small files, and also I moved the files from Penn State server to Amazon Cloud, and my student performance increased 10%. Because of this not having to wait for things to happen and get distracted. That's anecdotal. Whether or not you've looked at that empirically or not is what I'd be interested in.
Yeah, I'm sure. I have not looked at those numbers for our software in particular, but certainly in general. For example, Google ran a study where they induced an extra 200 to 300 millisecond latency in search results. You would think that the amount that we search is the amount that we need to know stuff. It's not impacted, certainly not by 200 or 300 milliseconds. What they found was inducing just that latency reduced the number of searches that people made by 0.7%. So there the effect size is not that large, but the fact that it's robust and present just with that tiny amount of latency says that I think this stuff absolutely matters. And one of my favorite solutions to this in terms of individual learning is that at UC San Diego, our building is incubating a nonprofit called the Foundation for Learning Equality. And what FLE does is, this is Jamie Alexander and colleagues, they have taken the Khan Academy content and put it on a very expensive, very inexpensive embedded computer. A whole thing costs less than $100 that stores the entire Khan Academy that you can then send to anywhere in the world and plug into a TV. And that obviously reduces all of the network issues.
Thank you. This is a very good talk. And I'm glad that you used the metaphor of design studio learning as model for exploring these features, because I did some participant observation in physical design studio programs, and so it's interesting to contrast that experience with the online model you're talking about. One of the things I have question is, I found, and you mentioned this, one of the great values for studio learning is that students get peer feedback from each other, and these are not quite like, there's a multi-directional feedback. And what actually happened in the studio I observed was that at the very beginning, the instructor had to do more scaffolding to help both directing the peer reviewers and also to help the presenter to digest and to basically to integrate these feedbacks, because not all of them are going to be positively helpful to the continuation of the iteration. And I found you emphasized that in the second point when you create this small group discussion. But it seems the first and third atom emphasize a lot about unifying the format and direction of feedback. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on this, whether there's any point you could actually create this scaffolding effect, like losing the direction at some point.
So I think that your question about being able to spin up students' ability to both give and receive feedback is critical. And for me, the motivation of the studio is personal. When I was an undergraduate in graphic design, taking classes at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, the studio was how you got your feedback. And I thought it was a wonderful model. But one thing that you see there is when you have 4 years of art school, where everybody is being socialized to do that kind of learning, you learn a lot both as a giver and a receiver. When you start out, receiving feedback is the psychological equivalent of being hit over the head with a baseball bat. And I think that that's actually one thing that's important for students to learn, is being able to receive feedback, especially in the online case. It's basically private, but in a studio setting, it may be public, and I think there's interesting opportunities for doing that online as well. And I think that one challenge that we have with the state of flux that education's in general is that in a normal university, students know how to do school and teachers know how to do school. We know how to do the lecture thing on both sides of the podium. And when you change that, everybody has to relearn the rules of the game. Similarly, art schools have their rules of the game, which are a little bit different. But they're consistent across classes, and so you know what to expect. And I think one thing that will actually be important is that as we move from a state of flux to maybe a new normal, having some consistency across classes in terms of what to expect will be really helpful. And so speaking from an on-land perspective, one thing that I hope that the Design Lab can do on the UC San Diego campus is being a clearinghouse for pedagogy, so that we can have lots of different courses that are sharing what works, how to improve it, and some consistency, creating some consistency across classes will help everybody know what the rules of engagement are. I think you're exactly right.
So I recognize this question is fairly granular, but I'm curious about the fortune cookies. So in my experience with peer feedback, one of the distinctions that's hard is the separation of form and content. So students who master form are kind of privileged because whether they're great writers or they can produce video, it's very seductive and it's hard for them to get meaningful feedback on content. So I was curious what sort of cues or prompts you might generate in that instance that helps with that.
Yeah, and I'm going to write down all these questions you're getting because I think there's a lot there. So with writing feedback in particular, Nancy Summers and colleagues from Harvard have found that even if you ask feedback givers to give formative feedback, they will say things like, your sentence isn't quite grammatical. And so if you want to get feedback on the structure of an essay, it's very difficult to do. All of us I'll come back over to the center for the camera, all of us in the design field have the same problem where you give somebody a user interface and you ask for feedback and they say the font and the colors aren't quite right. And you're like, no, we're not at that point yet. That's not the kind of feedback I'm asking for. And I do think it's true that having the surface structure be compelling is helpful. And one thing that we've seen is that peer feedback one thing that's true in general is that people use surface structure as a cue to deep structure, in particular novices. That when we're doing decision making, whether it's product purchases or anything else, that the surface structure gives us some cues. An expert will know to look for the deep structure. So if you think about buying a product in a domain that you understand well versus one that you understand poorly, like people like to do lots of studies of wine to show that wine buyers are idiots. And you see that the labels and the other stuff matters more than the contents of the bottle for most purchasers. And I think that's one important aspect of fortune cookies is that we can get people to say, you can have feedback prompts that explicitly say, ignore all this stuff. How about this? And I think there are ways of teasing out the deep structure, which then in turn that is expertise creation.
First, I'll drink to that. But can I ask Scott, sort of following along with Kate's line of thinking there, at what point, because I was struck by, the topic you did, the piece you did there about the diversity of reaching out and the richness of that. But are there times where that diversity becomes a barrier to groups working together as well? For example, if we're just, I don't know, we're in international politics or something, and we're talking about policies or rules that are really germane to a region or a state or something. How do we sort out when that diversity is an advantage and when it may not be?
That's a great question. I think that in general, when you look at homogeneous groups, the study of teams in general, when groups are headed in the right direction, groups that have lots of experience working together or come from a common culture, which could be civil engineering as much as California or something like that. As long as when things are headed in the right direction, that homogeneity can be helpful. But one thing that we see with diverse workplace teams is that if you have people from diverse backgrounds, they may pop in and say, wait, I didn't get that. And you're like, come on, don't you know the thing already? But some of that questioning slows you down. And some of that questioning prevents dumb errors. And on balance, there seem to be benefits of that diversity, especially in the creative phases of projects, which is why you see all the enthusiasm for cross-functional teams right now.
When you showed the interface for providing peer feedback, there was like a yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, then the field where suggestions popped in. Were those like, we were looking at the end of a sequence? So I wouldn't look at those three things and then have one field with suggestions, right? If I said no to the first one, I would have had suggestions right then? Or were they kind of sequential?
We've done a bunch of different, I'm going to see if I have it somewhere. It's right here. Probably. Just said no. Try one more. No, sorry, I can't find it right now. But
Because the separating form from function, it seems to me if you have like form questions, was the performance guilty of this sin? Yes
Yes.
or no, right? And then as soon as they said no, then they would be given suggestions for recommendations related to that sin, right? That default?
I think the general answer to your question is that when you're going to mix label attribute feedback, present, absent, or yes, no, with qualitative feedback, that you only show the qualitative feedback when that makes sense. And so we now do things like animate in that text box, and the text box will have grayed out text that gives a prompt, and we'll experiment with different prompts about what yields the most relevant feedback for that particular label. And if the box isn't relevant, we don't show the box.
Thanks. And I was wondering too about, ideally the expert would generate all those suggestions, but probably, it might be possible even to harvest from other students looking at the variety of work and then put those randomly in the box and see which ones are selected most, and ultimately then maybe putting the most common ones at the top. And it just seems like it's an ongoing and interesting, really interesting space in which to work.
Yeah, and this is what's so exciting for me is there are so many things that we could do that I think are extremely powerful. If you think about how many millions of teacher hours of effort have been put into giving wonderful feedback. And even in the online classes with peer feedback, our best peer evaluators are amazing and offer these wonderful insights. And thinking about how we can harvest all of that insight that's being created around the globe that currently just gets shoved in file drawers and forgotten, that to me is a tremendously exciting research problem. There's so much to do there.
Hard work.
I have a question that you said that for the peer reviews, so when student reviews other student work, they learn some new skills, new knowledge. So which skill or new knowledge that is very unique that they can get just only from peer review process only? I'm just curious that, for example, if you debug the program, if you just writing the program and you do not have chance to debug it, you do not have that skill at all, even you are a very good programmer. So is this kind of any special skill that you can get from peer review as a reviewer?
Yeah, so I think you have at least two good insights in your question. One of them is the power of test-enhanced learning. That when we test our knowledge, there's a tremendous learning gain. And that's one reason why I think that programming is such a great thing to teach, is that by virtue of there being a computer, even though it's a narrow-minded, frustrating, tester, is that you get feedback immediately on what you did, and you know whether it's right or wrong. And when you write your essay about Kierkegaard, it may be a month before you find out whether your argument about Kierkegaard holds water or not. And that was a big part of the motivation of Peer Studio, is that we know that the more that you reduce the time between doing the action and seeing the result, the better off you are. And programming is like a success case from that perspective. In terms of what people are learning from doing peer review, for anybody who's ever written a scientific article, or heck, even written a philosophy essay about Kierkegaard, you're writing it and you think, man, I'm brilliant, this is awesome, this is going great. You submit it, and then the peer review process comes back and says, the authors of this article don't know anything, they forgot to cite X, and they're wrong about Y, and all of that stuff. And so what you're seeing is two different perspectives on the same work. And what's really funny is that when two academics write articles and then review articles, they're basically swapping. And each thinks that they're a genius when writing, and that the article that they're reviewing is written by idiots. And the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. And when you switch into, so one thing that I like about doing self-assessment at the end that I think helps cement the learning insights from peer review is that you submit your work and you think it's all good, and then you see somebody else's work, or you know, many students submit their work and they think it's not that good, that they're not that creative, that you know, I may have low self-efficacy, but be doing great work. And then you look at other work, and you see implicitly the structure of the problem space and the strengths and the weaknesses of particular submissions. And then you come back and you self-assess your own work, and you say, well, actually, you know, I didn't do a great job of that literature review either. Or, in fact, I did do a pretty good job of that thing. You know, that's okay. And I think by reviewing others' work, it really helps cement that kind of learning. And so even if there were no scalability needs of assessment, I think just simply doing the peer review gets you a long way. But if you were going to do it purely for the pedagogical value as opposed to for the practical value, you would probably carefully pick which assignments you were going to review. And I think that you know, folks like Dedrick Gettner and colleagues think hard about what analyses you have people perform. And so a future for this is to think about how do we get people not random assignments, but ones that are pedagogically valuable for the reviewer.
And another question that you have like fortune cookie that help to improve the quality of the review, the feedback. So I'm curious that did you measure that this kind of skill improve the collaborative learning? Because like people know how to give like useful feedback, so it might change their behaviors during like group works, and instead of just like give quick short feedback, they give more like useful feedback. So that is affect collaborative learning. Did you measure that?
Yes, I mean, the future is working in teams, and I think that we all know that. And I think that our educational system has two tensions pulling in opposite directions on it. One is there's more and more work that's in teams, and I think students are becoming, in some ways, better and better at working in teams. Research groups are now are more and more team-based. All sorts of stuff is more team-based. The rise of the online world at its worst makes us less comfortable with face-to-face interactions. And we've run some pilot studies where we're seeing a shift in students' preferences, where they prefer to be critiqued anonymously rather than in person, more than in the past. I mean, you can see that there's an actual delta there. But there are, you know, if you look at the literature and in the pilots we've run, it appears there is a shift. And I think that is dangerous, that in the Facebook era, we can lurk anonymously, and before we participate, we can carefully craft what we participate. And in real life doesn't work that way. It also happens in real time. And we need to figure out how to do that training. And I think that, you know, Talk About might be one small step at having, you know, you get both the carefully crafted submissions to the world, and you also get the in real time interchange with the world.
I'm wondering, one of the biggest concerns for MOOCs is definitely student retention. So I'm wondering this peer system paradigm, whether it just facilitates learning of those top students or those students who are going to finish this course by any way, or it can also help students who are likely to drop during the process.
I think that the retention problem in the online world is both not as serious and more serious than it appears. So if Amazon made all of their books available for free, I would download hundreds of books, and I would complete a very small fraction. My hunch is that the retention fraction would look, for my book reading, would look a lot like the retention fraction for free open online classes. And so in that sense, what you actually want to measure is the integral, the area under the curve. How much total reading is happening? How much total learning is happening? It's not the fraction that completes. Now, so to the extent that you view online education as purely an ad, then you want to just assess the magnitude of the ad. To the extent that for some people it sometimes becomes a substitution. Oh, instead of taking that general ed course, you know, in person in a community college, I don't want to drive there. Instead, I'll take it in the online version. You do lose all of the cohort benefits of saying, you know, Mary Beth, I'm stuck, can you help me out? Or she says, oh, I'm studying for the exam tomorrow, and I do the same because of peer pressure. And all of the inertia that you get from a co-located community, you lose a lot of that online. So I think that is the most pernicious aspect of retention. And it points out, I think, that the value of residential education often lies less in being in the same physical room as the person delivering the lecture, and much more as being in the same physical place as the inertia of your peers for those late night dorm conversations, and being able to build lifelong friends. That's the real value. And I think peer assessment both helps and hurts retention. We have seen that it absolutely, all of these peer learning things drive engagement and increase learning. They do, many of them, take up more time, and the more time you ask people to spend, the lower your retention rate goes. And so that tension is what drove our peer studio system, which tries to, instead of having a time-consuming calibration phase, has the in situ comparison. I think, was there a question?
While we're on the topic of retention, just more of a curiosity question than anything, is there any research out there investigating a possible relationship between course completion rate and personality? Because in my own experience, it really does take a certain kind of person to actually complete a Coursera course, especially among my community of, if we're already full-time students.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it depends a little on what you mean by personality. That the field of personality psychology is stuck with a challenge that few attempts to try and pin down a robust sense of personality hold up. That many of us are extroverts in some situations and introverts in others, or intuitive in one situation and something else in another. I think that one salient aspect that in a folk sense we might call personality, but is more background driven, is about how much education we already have. That when I've looked at the students in my classes, and when you look at the online education in general, it works awesome for people who already have a college degree, who have learned how to learn. I see a big spike in the 30 people in their 30s that are taking my class and other online classes, and I think that's driven by two factors. The first one is parents of young kids. You have all of this intellectual capacity and time, but it comes in 6-minute intervals. So the community college thing doesn't work. You can't leave the kid at home and then go do college for the day and then come back. But you do have 6 minutes to learn something new about the world, and so we see a lot of people who are young parents doing online education. We also see people who went to college from 18 to 22, did their thing, and then now realize that they want to do something different. And so for those students, I think the online education of today, even in its remedial form, is a pretty natural fit. For students who don't yet know how to learn, online education of today, not so good. And part of it is the lack of cohort. That if you haven't gotten the hang of it yet, having friends who are doing it can be really helpful. And so I take that, as Marcella's introduction pointed out, I take that as a rallying cry. Right behind you.
Hi, Scott. This may be a little off your main topic, but I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. What is the business model? Do you think there is a business model that a university would buy into that would allow MOOCs to continue?
I think there's no question that there is a business model that makes online education valuable. As you said, that that's not my area at all. But I think that the opportunity for someone to pay a small amount of money to gain more learning than they pay is clearly there. And for example, the Johns Hopkins data science specialization offered on the Coursera platform is to be able to get a certificate in data science from Johns Hopkins is a couple $100. And they've seen huge enrollments and interest in that. And I think that both for lots of practical job relevant skills, you'll see interest for the certificate. For things that are more, I'm curious about the world, I think it's more likely to be the case. You'll pay a book's worth amount of money for something like that, or maybe you go with the free version there. So I think that online education will see a freemium model where the basic something is free, and then something like a certificate costs a small amount of money.
One follow-up, one thing that made sense to me is that it's the wrong people doing the MOOCs. It's the people that own the content already. It's the Smithsonian Channel who has all of this stuff. If they could wrap a MOOC around their existing content, then all of a sudden they've driven a giant audience to their MOOC and made greater interest in their content.
Yeah, it's not at all clear. Well, I think the one thing that is clear about online education is I really hope it looks completely different a decade from now than it does today. I mean, I think there are some ways. I think one thing that the Khan Academy taught me, that Andrew Ng's videos taught me, is that the professor in the basement explaining things actually works a lot better in some cases than you might think. I watched one of Saul Khan's statistics videos this week, and they're great. And they're not high budget. I think often deans want to spend $1 million for 3D graphics, and I'm not sure why. Some cases that may help. But one thing that I think Saul and Andrew and others have done is by going with a punk rock, low budget ethos, they've reminded us to focus on the content. Now, whether our content delivery style is what it ought to be, well, for me, that's what the opportunity for experimentation in science will allow us to answer.
Hi, Scott. Going back to the peer review, you talked about the students who are doing the peer review also benefit from doing the peer review, not only getting the feedback. So have you done any experimentation in them seeing the other reviews that the other peers are doing, just like we do in conferences and things like that? Because that's very helpful.
Yeah, we've done a couple of experiments. I think that's useful in lots of ways. And so one of our experiments is that we'll tell the feedback givers, here's the other feedback that other people gave. And also we'll tell you whether your ratings in general tended to be high or tended to be low. That a hands-off statistician might look at the peer review problem and say, well, the goal is to infer the signal from these noisy ratings. And a more designed orientation says, well, you're getting the same people giving ratings across multiple assignments. And so you can give them feedback so they actually get better over time. And showing people what others do helps. One thing that is true is that lazy, bad reviews are incredibly demotivating, both for other reviewers and for the recipients. And so the best way to get a nasty gram on the online forum is that if you put 20 hours into an assignment and what you get back is just random gibberish as a review, which doesn't happen a lot, but it definitely happens some, I think we probably want to filter those out, and I think that is algorithmically possible. That's doable and important.
Okay. This is a question from Molly Joy Oberholzer. Thanks for your time. Could you tell us any more about ideas and prototypes to facilitate peer critique that were considered before settling on the fortune cookie?
We made a bunch of different prototypes. One thing that was really humbling when we designed the first peer review system is that Chinmay and I were working with Daphne Kohler, who is a world expert on artificial intelligence. And when we came into one design meeting with a bunch of ideas, Chinmay and I thought we were going to impress Daphne, and so we invented some very sophisticated algorithmic techniques that were going to have this complex deep learning model. It was going to do the same thing. And Daphne thinks about it for a moment, and she says, why don't we just take the median? And there were two things that were really smart about Daphne's insight, and that's what we went with, is the first one is that it's extremely easy to communicate, that if we tell people there's a magical deep learning model, people may attribute their scores to being bad AI. And The other one is that it's really robust, it works really well, and it gives you a nice baseline. And I think things will get fancier over time. And so from a score perspective, we thought about a number of fancier options. Some things that people are thinking about, and there were several papers at Learning at Scale this week, we certainly toured around with the ideas are, do you want to have peers give numeric ratings, 1 to 10, label-based ratings, yes, no, comparative ratings, this one is better than that one. If so, is it in general, or is it along a set of axes? Let's see, other things that you can think about are how many, do you try to get a small number of reviews that are of deep quality or a larger number of reviews that may be shorter? Do you randomly assign reviewers, or do you, which is what we've done so far in part for scientific reasons, or do you say things like, if we believe you have a good submission, if we infer you to be a hardworking student, we will ensure, or at least try to give you a review from another hardworking student. And if we think you're slacking, then you may well be reviewed by another slacker. So that way there's a parity of effort and reward. Or do you want to assign your best reviewers to people who may be struggling, who are trying hard, and a little bit of insight from an expert could really help. There's some wonderful research on jigsaw learning, which shows the benefits of diverse teams in schools. And I think you could think about how to use a jigsaw approach to peer review. In terms of feedback, there's lots of different stuff that you could do. One of the motivators for Talk About was that you could have an in-person critique, because you say different stuff off the cuff, and it might be easier if you're just giving responses right away, as opposed to having to carefully compose a thing. And so you could do a video studio as opposed to written notes. Do you want to have the feedback be deiptic in any way? That is, do you want to be able to be like, this thing here, and be able to make a referent on what's submitted or not? Do you want to use NLP algorithms to be able to assist with the grading? We've played around with that. So yeah, there's a ton of different things you can do. And I would treat the early experiments mostly, I think the takeaway is, this is a really promising direction, and none of the details should be taken as settled yet.
Great. Thank you, Molly, for your question, and thanks, Scott, for your answer. And thank you all for coming, and to Scott for coming across the country to be with us, leaving nice, warm San Diego to join us here today. Thank you for your insights. Indeed, scaffolding peer assessment is really a key to extending learning to huge populations everywhere. Thank you for helping us think about that.
Thank you.
With that, let's give Scott a nice round of applause. Thank you. And we'll call it a day. Thank you.